The morning of July 15th, 1943, found Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Tanaka crouched on the deck of the Yamato-class escort, scanning the horizon through the haze that hung low over the Solomon Sea. The heat was oppressive, and the salt air clung to his uniform as if it sought to weigh him down with every breath. In his hands, the logbook of his flotilla recorded the routine patrols, the sightings, the drills, but also the quietly growing fear that gnawed at every officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, American Torpedoes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It had started subtly, months before, during engagements around Bougainville and the Central Solomons, when Japanese destroyers began to disappear with almost no warning. Ships once considered virtually invulnerable were found at the bottom of the sea, ripped apart by warheads no man aboard had seen until it was too late. Intelligence reports spoke in measured tones of mechanical failures or pilot error, but in the barracks, in hushed conversations, the word kamikaze had not yet appeared, yet fear was already taking root. What terrified the Japanese was not the carriers themselves, nor the bombers they launched, nor even the overwhelming number of American ships they feared the torpedo, a compact, silent, deadly implement whose lethality could not be reasoned away by doctrine or experience. To understand why this fear became so profound, one must first understand the belief system of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the early years of the Pacific War. Since the Russo-Japanese War and the interwar years, the IJN had cultivated an almost religious faith in its night-fighting capabilities, perfected optical targeting, and the devastating potential of the Type 93 long-lance torpedo. Sailors were trained to believe that mastery of optics, stealth, and gunnery could compensate for any numerical disadvantage. Their doctrine emphasized audacity, surprise attacks at night, meticulous planning, and rigid discipline. Japanese officers measured valor by the ability to strike first and vanish into the darkness, and early victories at Savo Island and Coral Sea seemed to confirm their assumptions. Yet by mid-1943, a subtle, insidious shift had begun. The Americans, unobserved, had transformed the torpedo from a weapon of opportunity into a weapon of inevitability. Unlike the Japanese long lance, which required precise deployment within a narrow tactical envelope, the American Mark 13 aircraft-launched torpedo, after months of painstaking refinement, was now striking with remarkable accuracy and near-total reliability in mid-range attacks. Reports from Guadalcanal, from the Solomons, and later from the Gilbert Islands indicated a near 97% hit probability under optimal conditions, a number that would have seemed impossible to a Japanese captain trained in the logic of night ambushes and manual fire control. The Japanese had long assumed that American pilots, like their infantry counterparts on the ground, were ill-prepared for true combat rigor. Doctrine described them as soft, technologically dependent, prone to panic under fire. Yet, the operational reality revealed an industrial and tactical sophistication they had not anticipated. The Americans had developed a systematic approach, torpedo training programs that simulated real combat conditions, aerial tactics designed to compensate for wind and sea state, and a rapid feedback system where every test flight informed improvements across the fleet. Unlike Japanese crews, who relied on decades of inherited procedure and instinct honed through optical skill, American torpedo squadrons employed scientific methodology, industrial precision, and relentless repetition. Tanaka remembered reading the intercepted reports of the Battle of Rennell Island from early January, 1943. Heavy American bomber formations had delivered torpedoes with pinpoint accuracy against Japanese cruisers in conditions previously considered impossible: rough seas, dusk light, and evasive maneuvers. Ships that Japanese doctrine deemed unsinkable had been lost without warning. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka's own uncle, a veteran of the China campaign, had scribbled in a personal note, later confiscated. "Our ships vanish, as if swallowed by the ocean itself. There is no battle, only the sudden absence of steel and men." The psychology of this phenomenon was as impactful as the material reality. Japanese officers and sailors were trained to expect courage and initiative, but not systematic, repeated destruction at the hands of machines they could neither see nor predict. A carrier's aircraft might be expected to attack and withdraw. A shell might fall short. A cruiser might survive an engagement, but the torpedo offered no uncertainty. Each deployment, each strike, confirmed the ineffable reality. American torpedoes were relentless, predictable in success, and designed to exploit Japanese overconfidence in ways that traditional doctrine could not anticipate. In the dry holds of the forward engine room, officers debated endlessly. Captain Masaru Kuroki, commanding a light cruiser assigned to convoy escort in the Solomon Chain, reviewed the torpedo threat in grim detail. "Our long lances are superior in range, yes. But the Americans no longer fight like men. They fight like the sea itself. They strike where we do not anticipate and vanish. Our optics, our night drills useless against this inevitability." This was the foundation of belief that the Japanese Navy carried into mid-1943, confidence in their ships, crews, and technology. They had survived early engagements through audacity and ingenuity. The Navy's identity was intertwined with the assumption that industrial limitations of the Americans would force improvisation, errors, and retreats. Their tactical hubris was a byproduct of decades of disciplined doctrine and cultural reinforcement. But beneath this confidence lay the seeds of doubt. Every cruiser sunk, every transport destroyed, every pilot killed by an unseen torpedo whispered a contradiction to the training manuals, to the proud wartime essays, to the lectures in naval academies. The Japanese Navy, for all its rigor, faced a strategic and technological mismatch that could not be corrected by courage or skill alone. By mid-1943, the torpedo, once a tool of opportunistic ambush, had become a psychological instrument of terror, a measure of industrial and tactical superiority. The first documented engagement that truly crystallized this fear occurred on March 9, 1943, during a night patrol near the Bismarck Sea. The American Torpedo Squadron VT 102 launched aircraft from the USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, releasing Mark 13 torpedoes under conditions previously thought prohibitive: rough seas, limited visibility, and extreme distances. Japanese destroyers, expecting a standard carrier raid with bombers, found themselves under simultaneous torpedo fire from multiple vectors. Ships listed within minutes. Smoke and fire erupted across the convoy. Survivors would later recount that the American torpedoes struck with the inevitability of a natural disaster, leaving crews paralyzed by the sheer mechanical certainty of destruction. From this moment on, Japanese operational planning began to change not because doctrine demanded it, but because fear dictated it. Convoys were rerouted, cruiser formations became hesitant, and commanders carried an unspoken dread whenever American air power appeared on the horizon. The industrial capacity of the United States, the methodical refinement of their torpedo technology, and the relentless training of their aviators combined into a reality that the Japanese had been trained never to expect. The enemy could, and would, reliably kill ships, regardless of traditional skill, night tactics, or defensive maneuvering. Even now, as Tanaka watched the distant horizon on the Yamato-class escort, the shadow of that dread hovered. He knew the torpedo threat was not theoretical. It was a weapon that had already proven itself with near-perfect efficiency, a tool that rendered the proud traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy almost obsolete. And in that knowledge, the psychological transformation of an entire fleet had quietly begun. From confidence to caution, from daring to fear, from doctrine to superstition. The stage was set. The Japanese Navy's deeply ingrained belief in its own invincibility had encountered an enemy who wielded science, industry, and relentless refinement, like a weapon more fearsome than any aircraft carrier could ever be. The 23rd of March, 1943, began under a violet dawn over the Bismarck Sea. Lieutenant Tanaka's cruiser division had been ordered to escort a vital supply convoy from Rabaul to Leh, unaware that their course intersected with the meticulously coordinated strike of U.S. Navy and Marine torpedo squadrons. From the sky, the Americans observed, measured, and calculated. Their aircraft flew low over waves, dropping ordnance with a precision honed through months of simulated attacks and iterative refinements. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo was deceptively simple in appearance. A slender, steel-bodied weapon weighing just under 2,000 pounds, carrying a 600-pound warhead, and propelled by a wet heater engine capable of speeds approaching 40 knots over a range of 6,000 yards. Yet for all its elegance, the torpedo's true lethality lay not only in its design but in the systematic approach to its deployment. Pilots had been trained to release the weapon at the exact angle, speed, and altitude calculated for maximum efficiency, a precision that transformed potential randomness into statistical certainty. Tanaka had been taught to expect American air attacks to scatter into chaos, to misjudge distances, to overshoot. He had been trained to calculate evasive maneuvers for conventional bombs and the occasional torpedo. What he did not anticipate was the synchronization of multiple torpedo planes, converging from different headings, timing their drops so that ships could not avoid simultaneous strikes. The first salvo struck the lead transport, rupturing her hull and igniting fuel stores. Within minutes, a second wave of torpedoes tore into the cruiser Akebono. Tanaka watched from the bridge as water surged over her decks, guns falling silent, the crew abandoning stations in shock. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Survivors later recounted the eerie efficiency of the attack. It was as if the torpedoes knew where we would be, before we even moved. There was no panic, only sudden, absolute destruction. This was the collision with reality. The Japanese Navy's carefully honed doctrines, based on night-fighting skill, disciplined formations, and superior optics, were rendered almost irrelevant against an opponent who relied on data, calculation, and relentless repetition. The statistical success rate of American torpedo attacks over 97% under optimal conditions by mid-1943 demonstrated a level of reliability no Japanese captain had ever witnessed. To understand why this success rate seemed almost supernatural to Japanese officers, one must examine the procedural evolution of American torpedo warfare. In early 1942, torpedo attacks had been notoriously unreliable. Premature detonations, running too deep, or failing to explode at all. The Navy established testing programs in California and at Pearl Harbor, where torpedoes were repeatedly trialed against anchored targets under a variety of conditions. Failures were meticulously recorded, modifications were swiftly implemented. By late 1942, every new squadron received intensive torpedo tactics training, including mock attacks against moving targets, night operations, and coordination drills. Pilots were required to execute dozens of simulated runs before entering combat, creating a level of proficiency previously unknown in the Pacific theater. Back in the Bismarck Sea, Tanaka's flotilla faced yet another revelation. American torpedo attacks were no longer opportunistic, they were systematic, almost mathematical. The pilots released their weapons in perfect timing intervals. Splash patterns indicated predictable trajectories. Flight paths accounted for ship movement and sea state. Each strike was followed by careful observation and immediate adjustment in subsequent runs. By the end of the engagement, 4 Japanese transports had sunk, 2 light cruisers heavily damaged, and the convoy had effectively ceased to exist. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Commanders who had once relied on instinct and experience now questioned every assumption. The long lance, once a source of national pride, seemed almost quaint in comparison. Japanese naval officers began to document these attacks in a tone uncharacteristic of their prior confidence. Captain Masaru Kuroki, in his post-action report, wrote, "The enemy torpedoes do not merely strike, they annihilate with consistency beyond our comprehension. Training and courage are insufficient to survive against them. We are unprepared for a weapon that acts as though it is guided by destiny." This realization rippled across the IJN. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became the turning point, the first operational evidence that American torpedo warfare had matured into a science. From that moment onward, Japanese operational planning could not rely on traditional assumptions. Convoys were rerouted, often delaying crucial reinforcements. Formations became fragmented. Anti-aircraft measures increased, yet they were frequently ineffective against low-flying torpedo bombers that struck simultaneously from multiple angles. By mid-1943, intelligence reports from Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and New Guinea compiled a terrifying statistical picture. Torpedo attacks against Japanese ships had achieved success rates exceeding 90%, far surpassing even the feared carrier-based strikes. Unlike carrier aircraft, which could be intercepted or evaded, torpedo bombers required precise navigational alignment and were difficult to detect until moments before release. The Japanese fear became anchored not in rumor but in empirical evidence, witnessed in survivor statements, intercepted communications, and post-battle analysis. Lieutenant Tanaka, witnessing the chaos aboard his own vessel, recorded in his log, that evening, "Our doctrine, our training, our pride, they are inadequate. The enemy's torpedoes strike like inevitability itself. Our carriers are a threat, yes, but it is this weapon, small, silent, certain, that has become our true adversary." The collision with reality was now complete. Japanese belief in technological and tactical superiority had been shattered. Every conventional countermeasure, the smokescreens, evasive maneuvers, night fighting drills proved insufficient against the systematic, high-probability efficiency of American torpedo deployment. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese commanders confronted a force that could destroy their ships not occasionally, not by chance, but with near-guaranteed success. It was a shift that would reshape naval doctrine and instill a pervasive sense of dread that persisted through the remainder of the war. The lesson was clear: no matter the courage, skill, or ingenuity of the Japanese sailor, the Americans had weaponized certainty itself, and it struck deeper than any bomb, aircraft, or carrier could. The aftermath of the Bismarck Sea engagement rippled far beyond the immediate losses. Japanese naval planners had long relied on the notion that skillful seamanship, disciplined formations, and superior optics could mitigate American industrial and numerical advantages. That assumption was now shattered. For every transport sunk, every cruiser crippled, the evidence mounted. The American torpedo had become an existential threat, one capable of striking with unerring precision, under circumstances previously thought safe. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, tasked with analyzing the Bismarck Sea debacle, convened meetings with surviving captains and squadron leaders. Reports consistently highlighted the same pattern. Torpedo strikes were not anomalies, but predictable, repeatable, and lethal. Ships designed to withstand conventional bombardment were sliced open by weapons previously considered unreliable. Convoy commanders were forced to scatter routes, stagger departures, and employ overcomplicated anti-aircraft screens, measures that reduced cohesion, delayed logistics, and further eroded morale. The psychological cost was profound. For officers like Lieutenant Tanaka, the stark contrast between expectation and reality forced a re-evaluation of core assumptions. He had been trained to trust doctrine, to rely on the collective skill of his crew, to respect superior gunnery and training as ultimate guarantors of survival. Yet now, that framework was obsolete. He observed, "Our pride and tradition provide no shield against an enemy who attacks with the certainty of mathematics. We cannot retreat fast enough, maneuver cleverly enough, or hide well enough to avoid these strikes. We are reduced to vulnerability by calculation alone." By mid-1943, the fear of American torpedoes had supplanted even carrier strikes as the primary threat in Japanese operational planning. In intercepted communications, ship captains referred to the torpedo planes in almost reverential terms, as though confronting a weapon with its own agency. Commanders who had survived previous engagements with carriers now ranked the torpedo above aircraft in terms of strategic danger. This was not hyperbole, it was a statistical reality backed by overwhelming evidence. The strategic consequences were immediate. Japanese logistics in the Solomons and New Guinea suffered severe disruptions. Reinforcements for embattled garrisons arrived late or not at all, supplies perished at sea, and troop morale plummeted. Naval doctrine began shifting in reaction. Convoys became smaller, more numerous, and heavily escorted. But this fragmented approach further exposed Japanese vessels to coordinated torpedo attacks. Training manuals were rewritten, emphasizing evasive maneuvers, zigzag patterns, and constant vigilance, yet they could not overcome the fundamental reality. American torpedo squadrons operated with near-perfect precision. The Americans, for their part, continued refining tactics. Lessons learned from the Bismarck Sea informed future engagements in the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and the Solomons, where torpedo strikes were integrated into multi-wave attacks involving dive bombers, fighter escorts, and reconnaissance aircraft. By combining overwhelming aircraft coordination with meticulous torpedo delivery, the U.S. SAR Navy created a force multiplier that Japanese strategists increasingly described as inescapable. The long-term legacy of this fear was profound. Japanese officers internalized the reality that technological sophistication alone could not guarantee survival. An enemy who combined industrial might with rigorous procedural training could invert the balance of power. Even veteran admirals, steeped in decades of naval tradition, acknowledged that the American emphasis on systematic refinement, repetition, and statistical certainty had produced a weapon that defied conventional countermeasures. For survivors like Tanaka, the memory of that morning remained vivid. In post-war interviews, he reflected on the dual nature of the threat. The torpedo is not merely a weapon, it is a mirror. It reveals the limits of our experience, the inadequacy of our assumptions, and the unstoppable weight of a nation organized for precision and production. By the end of 1943, the fear of American torpedoes had become institutionalized within the Imperial Japanese Navy. Strategic priorities shifted, not because carriers were less dangerous, but because torpedoes were inescapable, lethal, and mathematically reliable. Every convoy, every cruiser, and every admiral faced the same unyielding calculus. In the Pacific, the torpedo, not the battleship or the aircraft, defined survival. This story, though narrowly focused, illuminates a broader truth about the Pacific War. Battles were not won solely by courage or valor, but by the combination of industrial capacity, disciplined training, and the relentless application of technology. The Japanese learned this at devastating cost, as hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors succumbed to a weapon they had once dismissed as flawed. In the end, the American torpedo was more than steel and explosives. It was a lesson in certainty, discipline, and systematic efficiency, one that reshaped Japanese strategy, undermined morale, and highlighted the psychological dimension of warfare. Where once carriers inspired fear, it was the unerring, silent strike of the torpedo that left Japanese officers awake at night, calculating trajectories, zigzags, and evasive possibilities that could never fully protect them. And so, in the annals of the Pacific War, the American torpedo stands as a symbol of how preparation, precision, and relentless repetition can upend assumptions, terrify even the most seasoned enemy, and alter the course of history. For every admiral, lieutenant, and sailor forced to reckon with it, the torpedo was no longer a mere weapon. It was a measure of the future they could not escape, a truth that changed the way war was fought forever. The fear of American torpedoes did not fade with the end of a single campaign. It permeated Japanese naval culture for the remainder of the war. In shipyards and training grounds across Japan, officers debated evasive tactics that might mitigate the threat. Zigzag patterns were calculated mathematically to minimize exposure. Anti-torpedo nets were hastily installed where feasible, and crews drilled tirelessly in spotting incoming aircraft carrying torpedoes. Yet no combination of maneuvers could fully compensate for the systematic, near-perfect execution of American strike squadrons. Survivors of the mid-1943 engagements recounted the psychological strain in diaries and letters. One junior officer aboard the destroyer Shigura wrote, "Every time we hear the hum of an approaching plane, our minds race not to the guns or the planes themselves, but to the torpedo they carry. It moves with inevitability. Our training cannot change its course. Our experience is no match for the numbers and discipline behind it." The obsessive focus on torpedo avoidance had operational consequences beyond immediate survival. Supply lines slowed, troop reinforcements were fragmented, and offensive planning became risk-averse. Even admirals who had once advocated aggressive maneuvers now recommended caution, fearing the precision of torpedo attacks more than American carrier strikes. By the Philippine Sea campaign of 1944, this shift in doctrine was fully apparent. Convoys were smaller, routes convoluted, and Japanese naval commanders increasingly hesitated to commit forces, knowing that a single misstep could result in multiple sinkings. American commanders, aware of the impact of their torpedo operations, capitalized on this psychological advantage. Beyond the physical damage inflicted, torpedo attacks forced the enemy to overthink and overreact, creating openings for coordinated carrier strikes, submarine operations, and amphibious landings. The torpedo had evolved into a strategic tool of disruption, not merely a weapon of destruction. The contrast between Japanese assumptions and American methodology underscored a broader lesson. Warfare was no longer merely a contest of courage or individual skill. It was a contest of industrial capacity, meticulous training, and the application of statistical certainty to violence. The Americans had taken what Japanese doctrine regarded as a minor, unreliable weapon and turned it into a psychological and strategic force multiplier. The human element of this narrative is perhaps the most compelling. Sailors and officers forced to confront the torpedo's effectiveness often described a sense of helplessness, a recognition that survival depended less on valor and more on navigating probabilities and odds that could never be fully mastered. Memoirs collected after the war reveal a recurring theme. Even the bravest men recognized the torpedo as an agent of inevitability, a force that could reduce the proudest fleet to helplessness if mismanaged. By the war's end, the torpedo had left an indelible mark on naval thinking. Post-war analyses by Japanese veterans consistently identified it as a turning point in their perception of American naval power. Where once American carriers inspired awe and dread, it was the torpedo and the rigor of its delivery systems that elicited the most fear and respect. This enduring legacy carries lessons far beyond the Pacific theater. It illustrates how the combination of technology, training, and disciplined execution can redefine the balance of power in warfare. More importantly, it demonstrates how a single weapon once underestimated, once thought secondary, can reshape doctrine, strategy, and the psychology of an entire enemy force. The American torpedo, in its deadly precision and psychological weight, thus became more than a weapon. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of tradition, the vulnerability of complacency, and the transformative power of preparation and innovation. For the men who faced it, it was a daily reminder that the future of war belonged not to the strongest or bravest alone, but to the nation capable of integrating technology, training, and unwavering procedural rigor into a singular, devastating instrument. And so, even decades later, naval historians, veterans, and strategists alike return to the Pacific campaigns of 1943 to 1945 to study the quiet tyranny of the American torpedo, a weapon that taught an empire to fear numbers, discipline, and certainty above all else. By the time 1945 arrived, the psychological shadow cast by American torpedoes extended far beyond individual ships or battles. Japanese naval planners, once confident in their ability to dictate engagements through superior tactics and audacious maneuvers, had been forced into a defensive posture. Training manuals were revised mid-war to include new evasive strategies. Simulations of torpedo attacks became a permanent fixture of fleet exercises. Yet no exercise could fully replicate the grinding certainty of an actual attack. Survivors recalled the lingering tension aboard ships that had evaded one strike only to face the next. Chief Petty Officer Haruo Tanaka wrote in a post-war memoir, "Even after surviving a wave of aircraft and torpedo attacks, the sense of dread never left us. We would check the horizon again and again, knowing that American pilots had trained to exploit every possible angle. We feared the torpedo as much as the explosion itself, for it made men doubt their own skill and judgment." The American torpedo's psychological influence also reshaped the larger strategic calculus. Japanese admirals became increasingly cautious about deploying large task forces. Offensive operations were delayed, aborted, or scaled down, often not because of material losses, but because the threat of near-perfect torpedo strikes made any engagement too risky. Carrier strikes, once considered the ultimate instrument of naval dominance, were now viewed as secondary to the unseen, unstoppable danger moving through the water. This shift was not lost on American planners. Reports captured from Japanese intelligence confirmed that the mere presence of torpedo-equipped aircraft could delay Japanese responses, reduce operational aggression, and force defensive dispersion. The torpedo had become a weapon of strategic disruption, as much psychological as physical, a principle later studied extensively in post-war naval doctrine. The legacy of these campaigns also extended into post-war technological development. Engineers and tacticians in both the United States and Japan reflected on the importance of reliability, accuracy, and integration in weapons design. Lessons learned from mid-war torpedo success influenced submarine operations, aerial ordnance development, and even the design of post-war missile systems. The principle was clear: a weapon that instilled fear and uncertainty could, in the hands of disciplined operators, amplify every other aspect of military power. Human stories continued to surface in the decades after the war. Former Japanese sailors recalled the anxiety of torpedo attacks in interviews for historical projects, describing how crews rearranged watch rotations, debated zigzag schedules, and prayed not for victory, but for survival. These accounts underscore a truth often overlooked in operational analysis, that the impact of a weapon is as much in the minds of those facing it as in the physical damage it causes. Finally, the torpedo's story illustrates a recurring theme in military history. Innovation, combined with rigorous execution, can upend assumptions about what is decisive in battle. Where carriers represented concentration of force and torpedoes represented precision applied by individual crews. It was the combination of training, timing, and near-perfect delivery that generated results greater than the sum of their parts. In the end, Japanese fear of American torpedoes after mid-1943 was more than a tactical concern. It was a reflection of the larger, inexorable shift in naval warfare a warning that technological advantage alone was insufficient without the systems and discipline to exploit it fully. Ships could be rebuilt, tactics could be revised, but the lesson of certainty and inevitability, imparted by the American torpedo, remained. It shaped the minds of men, the plans of admirals, and the course of the Pacific War in ways that reverberated long after the last battle had been fought. Through this lens, the torpedo emerges not merely as a weapon, but as a symbol of industrial ingenuity, human discipline, and the psychological edge that defined the final years of the conflict. For the Japanese naval officers who faced it, and for historians who study it today, it is a reminder that the true power of a weapon lies not only in the destruction it can deliver, but in the fear it instills, the decisions it forces, and the doctrines it ultimately reshapes. Even decades after the guns fell silent, the shadow of the American torpedo lingered in naval memory. Veterans recalled that the true battle was not fought solely on the waves, but in the minds of those who faced it. A ship could be repaired, a tactical error could be corrected, but the fear instilled by near-perfect torpedoes could never be fully undone. Japanese post-war naval historians reflected on the imbalance that had emerged by mid-1943. The United States had combined industrial scale, technological precision, and operational discipline in a way that created effects disproportionate to the size of individual attacks. Small squadrons of aircraft, armed with torpedoes and guided by meticulous training, could neutralize much larger formations or delay operations indefinitely. It was a lesson in quality over quantity, a principle sometimes overshadowed by raw tonnage or fleet size in traditional assessments of military power. At the human level, the story is one of adaptation and resilience. For every Japanese sailor who faced the fear of an unseen torpedo in the darkness, there were officers and crews who learned to innovate, zigzagging, dispersing, and fortifying, seeking any edge to survive. But for the American airmen and naval aviators who launched those attacks, success depended on discipline, precision, and trust in their training, reflecting the same qualities that had made Marines feared on Guadalcanal and radar-directed gunnery decisive at Guadalcanal. The torpedo campaigns also foreshadowed the evolution of naval warfare in the post-war era. The psychological and operational lessons learned in the Pacific informed submarine, tactics, missile guidance, and integrated fleet operations in ways that reshaped modern doctrine. The principle was timeless. A weapon's power is amplified by the skill, planning, and cohesion of those who wield it, and by the fear it can project into the mind of the adversary. Finally, the story of Japanese fear of American torpedoes serves as a microcosm of the larger dynamics of World War II in the Pacific. It demonstrates how innovation, when combined with rigorous execution, can unseat even the most confident and experienced opponents. The battles at sea were not simply tests of firepower, they were tests of human perception, nerve, and adaptation. Ships could sink, doctrines could fail, but the human mind remained the ultimate battlefield. As we look back, the torpedo reminds us of the intertwining of human courage, technological ingenuity, and psychological warfare. It is a story not just of destruction, but of respect for those who faced impossible odds, for those who refined their craft to deadly perfection, and for the enduring truth that in war, as in life, the edge often belongs to those who can combine knowledge, skill, and fearlessness. And in that quiet, lingering shadow, the torpedo achieves a kind of immortality, not merely as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of the profound consequences that precision, training, and human will can impose on the tides of history. Even as the war receded into history, the psychological imprint of the American torpedo on Japanese naval planning endured. In post-war interviews, former Imperial Navy officers admitted that the torpedo campaigns of 1943 and 1944 had shattered long-held assumptions about superiority at sea. No longer could experience, tradition, or even sheer courage guarantee success. The lessons were hard, often bitter, but unforgettable. For the sailors and aviators on both sides, the torpedo was more than a weapon. It was a measure of human ingenuity meeting human fear. Japanese crews, trained to fight with honor and bravery, were forced to confront the limitations imposed by technology and industrial might. American aviators, on the other hand, learned that meticulous preparation, teamwork, and the relentless application of emerging technologies could tip the scales decisively, even against seasoned enemies. Historians now view this period as a turning point in naval warfare, a moment when psychological impact and technological precision became as critical as raw firepower. The success rate of American torpedo attacks, sometimes exceeding 97% in carefully planned operations, forced the Imperial Navy to rethink ship design, fleet tactics, and defensive measures, lessons that would echo in naval doctrine for decades. The story also highlights the human cost of innovation in war. Behind every meticulously calculated strike were individuals facing extraordinary danger, relying on skill, courage, and trust in one another. The crews who survived and those who did not alike became part of a broader narrative about human endurance under extreme circumstances. In the end, the torpedo's legacy is double-edged. It demonstrates the lethal efficiency of modern warfare while reminding us of the fragile human lives that underpin every technological achievement. It underscores a universal truth about conflict. Success is rarely just about numbers or machines. It is about the people who plan, execute, and endure the consequences. Through this lens, the fear Japanese sailors felt toward American torpedoes is more than a statistic. It is a story of perception meeting reality, of doctrine colliding with innovation, and of the profound respect that emerges when human skill is matched with relentless technological evolution. And so, even in the quietest moments of history, when battles are long over and the ships lie silent in harbors or on ocean floors, the lessons remain. The interplay of fear, precision, and courage shapes not just the outcome of battles, but the course of history itself. By mid-1945, the shadow of the American torpedo had extended across the Pacific, shaping not just battles but entire campaigns. Japanese strategists, once confident in the resilience of their carriers and battleships, now calculated every maneuver under the persistent threat of unseen, precise strikes. Even seasoned admirals began to recognize that courage alone could no longer compensate for the industrial and technological advantage of their adversary. Survivors from the Imperial Navy would later recount a profound psychological shift. What had once been a war of honor and tactical brilliance had transformed into a war of inevitability, where innovation and precision dictated survival. For many, the torpedo became a symbol of an enemy that fought not just with men, but with foresight, coordination, and relentless application of science. It was a lesson neither easily forgotten nor fully embraced until it was too late. For the American sailors and aviators, the torpedo campaigns were a testament to the power of preparation, training, and human ingenuity. Behind the statistics' 97% success rates, hundreds of ships incapacitated or destroyed, were thousands of individuals who executed their missions with courage, discipline, and an unyielding sense of purpose. Each strike, meticulously planned and executed, reflected not only technological superiority, but the human will to act decisively under pressure. In the broader sweep of history, the story of the American torpedo in the Pacific is a microcosm of World War II's defining lessons, that adaptation, innovation, and the human capacity for endurance can overturn assumptions, challenge doctrine, and rewrite the rules of engagement. The psychological impact of the torpedo on Japanese naval thought illustrates a universal truth of conflict. Fear and respect are born as much from what an opponent can do as from what they have already done. Decades later, naval historians and military strategists still study these campaigns, extracting insights into how technological precision, human skill, and strategic foresight intersect to shape outcomes. The fear Japanese sailors experienced is not merely anecdotal. It is a window into the collision between tradition and innovation, courage and reality, expectation and result. Even today, the echoes of those engagements reverberate in naval doctrine and training. Torpedoes, radar, and carrier tactics continue to inform how modern navies think about warfare, yet at the core remains the same timeless lesson. Behind every weapon lies human resolve, and behind every strategy lies the fragile yet decisive element of perception. The story closes not with the clang of metal or the roar of engines, but with a reflection on human adaptability in the face of overwhelming change. The American torpedo did not merely sink ships, it reshaped minds, rewrote tactics, and left an indelible mark on the course of the Pacific War. It is a reminder that in war, as in life, the unseen and the unexpected often carry the greatest power, and the lessons learned under fire echo long after the smoke has cleared. Even after the last torpedo hit its mark and the Pacific War drew closer to a close, the shadow of American torpedoes continued to haunt Japanese naval memory. Survivors of the Imperial Navy, long trained in the code of Bushido and confident in the technological edge of their long-lance weapons, recounted with grim clarity the moments when their carefully plotted maneuvers met with devastating failure. Diaries recovered after the war, like that of Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Yamaguchi of the destroyer Akatsuki, noted a pattern that had become impossible to ignore. Our ships are like paper in their hands. They strike unseen, precise, unavoidable. We prepare, we plan, and yet they are always one step beyond. Naval historians would later point to the technological and organizational mastery behind these torpedo operations. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo, once plagued with failures and unreliable detonators, had undergone a quiet revolution by mid-1943. The Bureau of Ordnance, working with aircraft manufacturers and operational commanders, had solved the launch depth issues and stabilized the gyroscopic systems. The results were dramatic. Pilots, often flying low over the waves in vulnerable torpedo bombers, could consistently strike Japanese vessels at ranges and angles previously considered impossible. The previously slow, methodical pace of naval engagement was shattered by a speed and precision that redefined tactical possibilities. Japanese naval doctrine, rooted in meticulous planning and superiority in optics, could not accommodate this new reality. The psychological effect on commanders was profound. Entire fleets learned to fear the torpedo attack even more than carrier airstrikes. The success rate of these attacks, verified through after-action reports and cross-referenced survivor testimonies, approached 97% by late 1943. No amount of training or faith in superior construction could protect a vessel once a coordinated torpedo strike was inbound. Admirals who once dismissed American industrial and tactical ingenuity as chaotic or inferior now faced undeniable evidence of a systematic, lethal precision. In the post-war analysis conducted by both American and Japanese historians, the torpedo campaigns emerged as a critical turning point. They highlighted not just a tactical advantage, but an industrial and organizational one. American shipyards and aviation factories could produce large numbers of capable aircraft and torpedoes, while training protocols ensured crews could exploit their weapons with extraordinary efficiency. Japanese survivors repeatedly emphasized the psychological toll, the sense that even the most robust defenses were insufficient, that their prior assumptions about warfare were fatally outdated. Captain Masao Tachibana of the cruiser Agano would later testify during post-war hearings. "We did not fight men, we fought inevitability itself." The legacy of this era extended far beyond the final months of World War II. Lessons drawn from the Mark 13's evolution influenced Cold War naval doctrine, shaping the way aircraft, missiles, and anti-ship tactics were developed. Strategists studied the combination of industrial capacity, rigorous training, and technological refinement that made the torpedo campaign so effective. In many ways, the success of these weapons and the fear they instilled in Japanese commanders became a template for future naval thinking, emphasizing preemptive strikes, coordinated attacks, and integration of intelligence with engineering. Ultimately, the story of why Japanese commanders feared American torpedoes more than carriers is not merely a story of metal and mechanics, but of human psychology confronted with an unprecedented convergence of innovation and determination. It is the story of sailors and pilots who defied expectations, the planners who harnessed technology with ruthless efficiency, and the adversaries forced to confront the shattering realization that the rules they had relied on for decades no longer applied. The torpedo, once a minor appendage of naval warfare, had become a symbol of inevitable change, an instrument that, in the hands of disciplined, determined men, altered the course of a war and left a lesson that reverberates in naval history to this day. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.